That is so fun. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Joey Newcomb doing his song, Mi Ke'amcha Yisrael, who is like your nation, Israel. How are you doing, my holy sisters and brothers? Nothing's really going on in the country, right? But maybe there's enough going on that we could use some beautiful wisdom from our sages, some fun and uplifting and inspiring counter-programming, as it were. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us as we get going on a lovely Monday evening? Michelle from Indiana, Stephen from New Hampshire, Yehudit from South Carolina, Paula from Chicago, Jim Ringenberger from Cape Coral, Florida. Who's that? I don't know. Rocky Bull Islam. Not sure what you're saying, but welcome. Hannah from Tucson, Lucy from Minneapolis, Diana Ruth from San Diego. Hannah says Shavua Tov. Stephanie says Shalom Aleichem. Nancy with us from North Carolina. How are you doing, everybody? And do we have someone over on the YouTube side? Yes, we do. Mirasia is with us from Atlanta. And Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. All right, let's see where we're holding. Tonight, we're going to have some pictures and illustrations to look at. This tractate, Eruvin, so much of it is really about our physical spaces and how we adjust our physical spaces for holiness, to enhance the joy of Shabbos, and to enter into relationship and positive and constructive relationship with our neighbors. Okay, so generally, where are we holding? This is Daf Pei Hey, page 85 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 8. We're completing our discussion of the third Mishnah in chapter 8 and starting our discussion of the fourth Mishnah. Generally, we're defining shared spaces where people have rights to those spaces and thus restrict each other. If this is your first time, let us know so that we can welcome you. But generally, we're talking about the concept that biblically we're prohibited to carry objects on Shabbos from a private domain to a public domain or from public to private. If two houses share a courtyard, that seems like a private domain. I mean, it's only two, it's a courtyard just for two homes. But because people from both houses have rights in that courtyard, carrying from one of the houses out into the courtyard on Shabbos has that flavor of carrying into a public domain. And in the time of King Solomon, it was decreed that you could not carry objects into a shared courtyard on Shabbos unless the members of the courtyard came together and created an eruv chatzeros, a joining of the courtyards, a joining of the rights in the courtyard of those houses. And now it's as if they're all one entity and they can carry around the courtyard just as they can carry objects inside their houses where there's no transfer of domains. But if they don't join in the eruv, right? If there's 4 houses in the courtyard and 3 of them have joined in the eruv, but the 4th house hasn't, then the members of that residence that didn't join the eruv actually restrict everybody from carrying from their houses to the courtyard on Shabbos because there's somebody who has rights in that courtyard who isn't a member of the eruv. So if they intended to join but just somehow didn't get around to it, were prevented, forgot, then what they can do is they can't carry on Shabbos anyway because they're not part of the eruv, but they can renounce their rights to carry in the courtyard to the other members of the courtyard, to the other residents there. And then the ones who did join in the eruv will be permitted to carry in and out of their houses on Shabbos. The one who couldn't carry anyway obliges his neighbors by renouncing his rights in the courtyard. Okay. Now what we're talking about is getting a little bit more detailed on courtyards, and the case of where we have neighboring courtyards, right? If there's a passageway between two courtyards, they have the option, not the obligation, of joining the two courtyards as if it was one big courtyard. Then they all join in the eruv, and then they can not only carry in and out of their houses to their own courtyards, but even through the passageway to the other courtyards. If they have such a passageway, but they didn't join in the eruv, then they can carry in their own courtyards, but not in that common area that's common to both of them, because it is part. They can't carry in the other courtyard since they didn't make the joint eruv, and that common area, the passageway, is part of both courtyards, as it were, and that's why it becomes prohibited to both. It's convenient to both, and now it's prohibited to both. If, however, that common area is convenient to one of the courtyards, inconvenient to the other, perhaps because one courtyard is higher than the other, right? It's like just literally the ground level of one courtyard is high, the other one is low, and the common area between them is at that lower level. So then it's convenient to the residents of the lower courtyard, inconvenient to the residents of the upper courtyard, and the sages decree that in such a case, the common area becomes usable by the residents for whom it is convenient on Shabbos, but prohibited to the ones for whom it is inconvenient. If that common area is lower than the upper courtyard, but higher than the upper courtyard, so it's inconvenient to both, now we have a dispute. Rav says, because it's inconvenient to both, one has to lower in order to get stuff onto it, the other one has to throw things up, sort of, lift and elevate. If they want to place objects in that courtyard, that shared area that's above the ground level of the lower courtyard, Rav would say it's inconvenient to both sides, and therefore it's prohibited to both. Shmuel would say, well, it's a little more convenient to lower things than it is to throw them up or to, elevate them, raise them, lift them. So he would grant the use of that shared space to the one for whom it is more convenient, meaning the upper courtyard, because they lower objects onto it. They get the use of it, and the lower courtyard would not. That's a dispute between Rav and Shmuel. Now we have a new case, and we're going to come back to this dispute between Rav and Shmuel as it plays out. So the new case is, what happens if we have between two courtyards a little alleyway that has a well in it? Now, what it looks like here is that there's two houses, and indeed they might be two houses, but the houses are at the edge of a courtyard. So imagine that there's two courtyards. Between the courtyards, there's a little alley, a closed alleyway. And the only access to this alleyway is through those windows. Now, as we've learned, windows, even a small window that's 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, is considered a passageway. And they could have joined these two courtyards by way of this passageway through this shared alley. But they didn't. They didn't make a joint eruv. So they have separate Eruvin, right? The people whoops. Oy, sorry. Come on. There. The people who live on one side of this courtyard, right? They have an eruv and they can carry in their courtyard. And the people who live on this side, they have an eruv and they can carry throughout their courtyard. And this area is one that is equally convenient or inconvenient, but it's the same to both sides. And so it's going to be prohibited to both sides to carry there on Shabbos. But the detail now that's new is there's a well there. So people might want to get some water out of this well. Now, can they enter that area? No, it's restricted to both. It's prohibited to both of them. But they have this window, and so they could lower a bucket into the well and draw some water and pull it into their courtyard through the window. Both sides can do that. Is it going to be permitted? The key to this discussion is that nobody's going to walk in that restricted alleyway. You can't walk in there on Shabbos. But can you use a bucket and just draw water out of it and pull it in through the window? And if you can do that, is this going to be a problem where they're going to restrict each other from doing it? That's the case that we're dealing with. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, well, if they have a ledge, right? So you see they have this like what do you call it? A beam. It looks like a beam, but here in our discussion, they're going to call this either a ledge or a reed. Okay, so the ledge would be actually if it's wider, if it's the same width of the window, and that's actually what Shmuel is talking about. So he says if they have that ledge there, so the ledge is like a marker, it's a sign. They don't really use the ledge so much, but it's symbolic. And the symbol is, by having that ledge there, what they're saying is, I'm not going to walk into the alley and take water from the well by walking in the alley. I'm only going to pull water out of the well through this window. In that case, they can both draw water from it. They're not going to prohibit each other. Even though they don't have a joint eruv, both sides are going to be permitted to use the well in the alley. Rav Yehuda himself is going to say, and not only that, it doesn't have to be a full ledge. If it's just a reed, even just a thin stick that sticks out of the windows on both sides, because it's only symbolic in nature, and it signals to everybody, we're only going to pull water through the window. We're not going to go walking in that alley on Shabbos. But both of them would prohibit you to draw water because there's two sides that didn't join in an eruv together. Both of them, Shmuel and Rav Yehuda, would prohibit if there was no ledge, if there was no reed, if there was no symbolic marker under those windows. Rav, however, would say, look, nobody's walking in the alley. Nobody's making use of the alley except to go through its airspace, right? They're going to take that bucket through the airspace and then lower it into the well. The well is actually a separate domain altogether, because we know that the well goes down more than 10 handbreadths, and it's wider than 4 by 4 handbreadths at the bottom, and that makes it its own separate domain. So what use are they going to make of the alley? Only to go through its airspace. And according to Rav, if you're only going through the airspace of this shared region between two courtyards, that's not, the two sides are not going to prohibit each other, and the fact that they didn't make a joint eruv is not going to restrict the two sides from making use of the well. So according to Rav, they don't even need the ledge or the reed. The fact that they're only making use of the well by going through the window is enough that they don't restrict each other and they can make use of it. Now the question is asked in the Gemara, how do we know that Rav rules? Is it from this case that we know that Rav says if you're only using the airspace, then you're not going to restrict each other? And the answer is no, because we're applying that ruling to this case, but we're not getting it from this case. Rav didn't consider this case. We're just applying this teaching of Rav that people who merely use the airspace of a shared area don't restrict each other in terms of needing an eruv in order to use that on Shabbos. So what case is it that Rav ruled on? Now we go back to this complicated case that we had yesterday, but now we're going to simplify it, and I think it's going to come a little bit clearer. So we had this case, we discussed it yesterday, of two balconies. And this is the lakefront apartment building, right? So the two apartments each have a balcony directly over the lake. And they would like to draw water from it on Shabbos. However, only the upper balcony has made partitions around the hole. You can see there's a hole in the upper balcony, and then there are these partitions, this little fences on four sides of the hole that extend down from the balcony. Those partitions define the hole itself as another domain in the same way that a well would be a separate domain. So they can draw water on Shabbos directly from the lake. Now, the lower balcony doesn't have such a hole or partition. So on Shabbos, they cannot just extend their bucket over the side and pull up from the lake, because then they would be drawing from a Carmelis, which is the lake is neither a private domain nor a public domain. It's what's in between, by rabbinic definition, is called a Carmelis. So they can't draw water from it up to their balcony directly. But what can they do? They can take their balcony, they can take their bucket and literally throw it up to the upper balcony and then go down through the hole and draw water from it. So they're sort of using the airspace across the gap between the two balconies. And the question is, are they going to be able to do that? And if they are able to do that, and the residents of these two balconies didn't make a joint eruv together, does that mean that they restrict each other? And in the absence of such an eruv, nobody can draw water on Shabbos? That's the question that was asked in the case of the upper and lower balconies. Now, Rav says that the residents of the balconies restrict each other only if the balconies are within 4 handbreadths of each other, horizontally speaking, and within 10 handbreadths of each other, vertically speaking. In other words, the two balconies are close enough together that it's as if it's one balcony. It's like one balcony. And since it's one balcony and they didn't, so it's, in other words, it's two houses that open into a common balcony, it's close enough, even though they're a little bit on a different level, but they're close enough together and they're close enough within height, right? Because they're within 10 handbreadths of each other. So really, it's a courtyard. It acts as a shared courtyard of two residences. And since they didn't enter into an eruv with each other, they restrict each other. They can't carry things in that balcony, in that shared balcony. Nobody can carry. Now that's if they're close enough together like this. However, now that they spread out a little, they're more than 4 handbreadths apart. So now it's a different case. It's not one courtyard, essentially, that is joining the two residences. Now it's two spaces, and now we're saying, okay, well, who gets the balconies, as it were? Is it more convenient to one party than the other? Now, we've already learned, Shmuel would say that Rav before said in another ruling that if one party is lowering and another party is throwing, it's inconvenient to both and neither of them can use it. Shmuel said, well, if one is lowering, one is raising, the one who's lowering, it's a little more convenient for him, so maybe we should let the one who's lowering his bucket into the lake, he can do it, but the one who has to throw his bucket up first and then lower through the hole, for him, it's that's definitely extra inconvenience, and therefore we're gonna let the upper balcony get water out of the lake and not be restricted by the fact that the lower balcony might, have rights in that sort of shared space because it's so inconvenient for the one from the lower balcony. That would be according to Shmuel. Give it to the upper balcony. According to Rav, neither one can use it because it's inconvenient for both of them. The upper balcony does have to lower the bucket and raise it through the hole, and the lower balcony also has to make use of it that way, although there's an extra step involved. So Rav says, however, that in this case, the residents of the lower balcony do not restrict the residents of the upper balcony from carrying on Shabbos. Why? Because they're not going to go walking from one balcony to the other. They're only going to throw their bucket over. In other words, they're only going to use the airspace of the shared area. They're not going to go walking over there. And because they're only using the airspace, they don't restrict the residents of the upper balcony. And it would seem that, so Rav does rule, and this is where we get it, that if they're only using the airspace, then they don't restrict each other and they're going to be free to do what they need to do. However, the fact that it's so much more convenient for one party than the other to make use of these balconies and that hole in the upper balcony tells us that we're not sure that that's the reason that Rav permitted it. It might not be because of the lower balcony residents were only using the airspace. It might be that it's because it's so much less convenient for them. And Rav does agree that where it's convenient for one and inconvenient for the other, then where it's totally convenient for one, not just a little less convenient, but it's convenient for one and inconvenient for the other, that's a different principle. And that might be why Rav permitted it in that case. Therefore, we do know that Rav somewhere ruled that if they only use the airspace, it's going to be permitted, but it's not from the case of the balconies. Rather, it's from yet another case. All right, so we're really getting a peek, a little bit into how these rulings are made and a little bit about how people lived 2,000 years ago. All right, so first of all, the general living situation was, this kind of shared courtyards. That was very common. Multiple houses sharing a courtyard, and then multiple courtyards sharing an alleyway. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But here we have a situation where, and this happens today as well, sometimes you have courtyards, and then between the courtyards, there used to be another courtyard with houses in it, but those houses, maybe they burned down. Maybe there was a fire, they burned down, and they haven't been rebuilt yet. And so what is between the two houses is a ruin. Okay, so here we have a situation where there's two houses on the edges, respective edges of their courtyards, and between them, there was some kind of dwellings, but they were destroyed, and there's still remnants of them. So a ruin, as we've seen, in order to permit carrying in a ruin, you do have to have an eruv. But they don't have an eruv in this shared space between them. It's like empty space, but it's not empty space. How is it not like empty space? Because there are walls there that define the fact that there's not just a ruin between the two courtyards. There are three ruins. Those are three distinct areas. One is close to one courtyard, another is close to the other courtyard, and there's a middle area, a middle ruin, as it were. So in that situation, Rav says that each courtyard may use the area that's adjacent to their courtyard, right? So they can use, this courtyard can make use of the near ruin, and that courtyard may make use of the near ruin, passing through the window. The only openings into these ruins are through a window, not through a door. And the middle courtyard is going to be prohibited to both of them, says Rav. Now, we met a few weeks ago a fellow named Rabbi Elazar, the Torah student. He's the student of a Torah academy. And he's a chutzpahdik young rabbi, meaning, he thinks he knows a lot, and when he hears something that doesn't sound right to him, no matter who he hears it from or in the name of how big an authority, if it sounds wrong to him, he's going to challenge what he heard. So Rabbi Elazar hears this teaching about the three ruins between two courtyards, and he hears it taught by a fellow named Rav Baruna. So Rav Baruna teaches it in front of Rabbi Elazar, the Torah student. And Rabbi Elazar says, "Did Rav really say that?" And Rav Baruna says, "Yeah, he said that." And Rabbi Elazar says, "Show me where Rav lives. I want to ask him about this personally." So Rav Baruna says, "Okay, I'll show you where Rav lives." So Rav is like the foremost Torah authority in this whole region of Babylonia and in this period in history. And Rabbi Elazar, the young Rabbi Elazar, gets taken to Rav's house, knocks on the door. Rav answers, and he says, "Did you teach that if there's three ruins between two courtyards, that the two outer ruins are going to be accessible just to those respective the people in the residents of those courtyards, and that the middle ruin is going to be prohibited?" And Rav said, "Yeah, I taught that." And so Rabbi Elazar said, "But you also said that when there's a shared area between two courtyards, and one side has to throw in order to reach it, and the other side can lower objects in and out of it, that's considered equally inconvenient to both sides, and therefore it's prohibited to both. So according to Rabbi Elazar, Rav it was used right to prohibit the middle area, but he also should have prohibited the outer areas. Because, why? Because this guy over here in this courtyard, he can lower objects into it through the window. But over here, because this is just a ruin in between, he could actually throw an object through the two ruins to land over here. Now, is anybody going to do that? No, obviously not. But it's possible. Since it's possible, so there's access to this ruin here. This guy can lower into it. This guy can throw all the way over to it. Certainly, according to Shmuel, this area would belong to this guy because he lowers into it. The other one has to throw all the way over. But according to Rav's other teaching, that if one can lower and another can throw, that's inconvenient to both, and it should be prohibited to all involved. The whole area of the ruins should be prohibited. Rav says, who told you, Rabbi Elazar, that the way this was arranged is that there was 3 ruins in a row between the 2 courtyards? That's not how the situation was at all. In fact, we're talking about a situation where the 3 courtyards are in the form of a triangle. As you can see here, this is what Rav was talking about. There's a courtyard, there's a ruin that's adjacent to this courtyard, and there's a courtyard that's adjacent to this courtyard. There's just an opening between the 2 of them. And then the 3rd courtyard that he prohibited to both is way over there, and it's adjacent to the 2 ruins, not between them. Now that is going to make a difference. Before we explain the difference, what's going on here is worth noting, right? The young chutzpahdik, the young arrogant know-it-all who wants to go and challenge like a major authority in Torah law as if, well, this doesn't make sense to me. This is wrong. And the tone was off. He might have come there and said, could you clarify this for me? Because I'm having trouble understanding it. But the challenge was definitely too arrogant, and it was based on incomplete information. It's like he was looking for the gotcha and thought he found it, and in his, speed and arrogance to conclude that his elder was wrong, he created this insolent situation. And we all do that, right? We all do that. We hear something that sounds wrong and offensive, and we want to be quick to condemn. And we should really find out this thing that sounds offensive to us. What were all the circumstances that were involved? And if he had done that, if he had taken that more, perspicacious route, been a little more cautious, a little bit more humble, he would have learned something and not alienated Rav. So Rav explains to him that in this situation, okay, that area over there, prohibited, definitely prohibited, because it's equally convenient or inconvenient to both courtyards. Here, we have, and I'm not even sure why this didn't work with the 3 linear, but this is the way he said it. The only access to this area is through the window. This guy has direct access to it. This guy would have to throw over there. I guess he's saying it's not a case of lowering versus throwing. It's a case of direct access or indirect access. And that's what Rav made his ruling according to. And since everyone is prohibited to access through this other 3rd ruin, they might have gone through that window and come around this way, but it's prohibited to everybody. So Rav allowed this. Even so, it's in the shape of a tripod. The middle is equally inconvenient. The adjacent ones are different with respect to convenience, but the other side doesn't restrict through the air. Right, so again, because the access of one would only be through the air, only through throwing, right? The other one is direct. It's not just lowering versus throwing. It's direct access versus going through the air. And therefore, since going through the air doesn't restrict, we get it from this case of the three ruins arranged in a triangle configuration. And that completes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. If you have questions or comments, definitely get them in there. I'm going to be done pretty soon. We're just going to open our discussion of Mishnah number 4, and then I'll get to your comments and questions. Mishnah number 4, here of chapter 8, tractate Eruvin. With regard to one who placed his eruv of courtyards, eruv means joining, right? So joining the courtyards. In other words, there's 2 buildings in a courtyard, and it's as if it's like they both have rights in it, so it's joining the rights in the courtyard together. With regard to one who placed his eruv of the courtyards in a gatehouse or in a portico, right? How do we make this joining of the courtyard? All of the houses in the courtyard contribute some food, 2 meals worth of food, into a vessel, and then that vessel with the joint meals that are going to join the courtyard has to be stored in a safe place, namely in one of the residences. So what this Mishnah is going to be about is, well, where are you going to put that eruv? Where are you going to put the food that represents the joining of the courtyards? You have to put it in one of the residences in that courtyard. Now, there are structures that can be in a courtyard that are not residences, right? And if you put it in one of those structures, like a gatehouse or a portico or a balcony, then you didn't put it in a residence and you did not make a valid joining of the courtyards. You didn't make a valid eruv because you deposited the vessel with this shared food in the wrong place. Says the Mishnah, with regard to one who placed his eruv of courtyards in a gatehouse or in a portico, which is a roofed structure without walls or with incomplete walls, or one who deposited in a balcony, this is not a valid eruv. And one who resides there in any of these structures does not render it prohibited for the homeowner and the other residents of the courtyard to carry, even if he did not contribute to the eruv. So somebody might, like somebody's passing through, he's couch surfing. He's like, oh, don't worry about me. I'm happy to sleep outside. I'll sleep on the balcony. I like sleeping under the stars. I don't want to be, you have a big family, a small place. I'm not going to take up room in your apartment. Very happy to sleep in the balcony. So this guy who's sleeping in the balcony, he doesn't need to contribute to the eruv, meaning because if he was residing in one of the houses of the eruv, he has to contribute to the eruv, or he would restrict the other residents from carrying there on Shabbos. But if he's residing in a non-residence, if he's residing in a structure that is not a residence, then he doesn't restrict the others. He doesn't have to contribute to the eruv. And if he's sleeping there, it's just like he's passing through. He doesn't affect the rights of other people in the courtyard. If, however, one deposited his eruv, the vessel with the shared food, in a hay shed or in a cow shed or a wood shed or in a storehouse, this is a valid eruv as it is located in a properly guarded place. These are not normally thought of as residences, but they have 4 walls and a roof. They can be used as a residence. It's a wood shed or a cow shed or some other kind of storage, building. Could be like a man shed, right? Is that what they're called? Like out in the backyard. But if it has 4 walls and a roof, then it could count as a residence. If a person was staying there, he would need to contribute to the eruv, or he would restrict others from carrying on Shabbos. And once you've collected the food in the vessel, if you want to store it in that storehouse or that cow shed or that barn, you could do that because it's a proper structure that would count as a residence if you wanted to use it that way. And one who resides there with permission, if he neglected to contribute to the eruv, he renders it prohibited for the homeowner and the other residents of the courtyard to carry. Rabbi Yehuda says, if the homeowner has there in the hay shed or the other places listed above a right of usage, i.e., if he is entitled to use all or part of the area for his own purposes, then the one who lives there does not render it prohibited for the homeowner, as the area is considered the homeowner's quarters and the person living there is classified as a member of his household. right? So if you are a guest in someone's house in that courtyard, so you don't have to contribute to the eruv. The homeowner does it, and he covers everyone who's a member of his household. But if you add a new person in a building that was previously unoccupied, like let's say the storage house, right? And no one was living there before. Now somebody is living there. Okay, so then he needs to contribute to the eruv, or he's going to restrict everybody else. However, that's only if you're renting it to him, and in the sense that he can lock the door and nobody else has a right to use that storage house while he's staying there. But if they're just letting him sleep there, but they themselves are going to walk in and out of that storage house because they keep stuff there, then he's not really a renter, right? He's not really a householder just because he's staying in that structure, because they retain their rights to walk in and out. And so this is the difference, of course, between just being a guest and being invited to stay in a structure in the guest house behind a house, but you're really just a guest. You're not paying rent. You can't lock the door and prevent the owner of the guest house from going in and out of it. On the other hand, if you're renting the guest house, well then, he would need to bring the sheriff to come in to kick you out, because you have rights as a renter of a property, right? If you're a renter in a property, the owner just can't walk in and out whenever he wants to. So he doesn't have that right of usage. And then there's going to be, as we see in the commentary, there's kind of gray areas where maybe you are paying a fee, maybe you really are living there, maybe you can lock the door, but the owner is keeping stuff in that shed or in that guest house. He can't just walk in and get it anytime, but he did retain the right to store some of his possessions in that place. That is going to limit the one who's staying in the guest house, and he will not need to contribute to the eruv, because really, since the owner of the guest house is also storing stuff in the guest house, then even though the guy might be paying rent, he's still, part of the householder's household, right? The homeowner's household. Okay. So we did that. Now, interestingly, in terms of these structures, which are not residences, right? The portico, which has a roof but no walls, or the balcony, or the gatehouse, which really are not residences at all, and can't be used that way properly. So you can't store the eruv that you use for joining the courtyard. You can't store that vessel of shared food. However, as we've seen, sometimes we're joining courtyards, not just because they have an entrance between them, but because they open into, this is an old drawing, but it's handy. Let me just fix it up a little bit. Right? So, right? So if you've got this situation, right, where you've got two courtyards, and they both open into a shared alleyway that's closed on one end, okay? So they must make an eruv so that they can carry inside their courtyard. They make an eruv so that they can carry inside their courtyard. And then they can merge the alleyways. They can make a merging of the alleyways. That's a shituf of the mavoy, of the mavoys. Let's say the mavoyim. And so that's the shituf, the merging, would enable them to carry on Shabbos objects out of their houses, through their courtyard, through the alleyway, and into the other courtyard. And they could also carry objects on Shabbos in the alleyway. That's only possible if they now collect some food from each courtyard and store that somewhere. Where do they store it? They have to store it in one of the courtyards. They could store it in one of the houses, but they don't necessarily have to. They could also store it just in some protected place in the courtyard, like maybe one of those porticos, right? That it has like a, what do you call it? Like a pergola, but it doesn't have walls. It's like a nice place where they might put a table and have outdoor meals. And maybe this guy who's passing through that doesn't want to sleep in one of the houses might be sleeping there. That's not a residence. That guy doesn't need to contribute to the eruv of the courtyard. But for the merging of the courtyards through the alleyway, the vessel that they collect some food for, that could be stored in the portico, because the key is it's in one of the courtyards. Where can they not store the merging of the alleyways, that vessel? They can't store it in the alleyway. At least not if it's unprotected. If there's some kind of, structure in the alleyway that is protected, that would protect it, then they could even store it in the alleyway. So these structures are good for the vessel that merges the alleyways, not good for the eruv that joins the rites in the courtyard. And we talked about the owner keeping possessions in his guest house, and that would mean that the one who's staying in the guest house doesn't restrict the other members, doesn't need to contribute to the eruv. There was a case of a very rich man, and this is the last thing we'll talk about, named Bonias. So Bonias was super rich, and part of his holdings as a rich man is he had a lot of houses in various courtyards. Excuse me. And he was very generous with the use of his properties. He just allowed people to stay in them for free. If they were poor, if they were having hard times, they were having medical problems, they were passing through. He just let people use his properties all the time. So then the question came before Rabbi, is it going to be necessary for the people who are staying in these properties to contribute to the Eruvin, right? The joinings of the courtyards in the courtyards where those properties of Bonias were located? And the answer ended up being no, they didn't have to contribute because he was just lending out the houses and he was maintaining some of his possessions in those houses. And so he needed, as the homeowner, to contribute to those courtyards, but his guests did not have to while they were staying there. The reason we're mentioning it now is that when the question came before Rabbi, so Bonias was there, and at another time his son was there, and Rabbi went out of his way. So who's Rabbi? Rabbi's the head of the Sanhedrin, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the compiler of the Mishna, an incredibly prominent Torah authority in his time and in history, also a very wealthy man. But he went out of his way to honor Bonias. Like he announced to other people that the great Bonias is here. And he's a prominent man, and you should honor this man. And some maybe wondered, like, why is he, being so flattering to this very rich man? Is it because this man makes donations and, sort of helps the nonprofit that Rabbi is running as an educator? And the answer is basically, yeah. Yeah. Not because it's like so useful to Rabbi personally, but there's a principle that anybody who uses his wealth for philanthropy, particularly to feed people and to shelter people and to educate them in Torah wisdom, that person deserves tremendous honor, and that is a teaching that we actually have in the Bible. In explanation of this story, the Gemara comments, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi, would honor the wealthy, and Rabbi Akiva would likewise honor the wealthy in accordance with Rava Bar Mari's interpretation of the verse. This is from Psalms 61, verse 8. May he be enthroned before God forever. Appoint mercy and truth, that they may preserve him. When may he be enthroned before God forever? Who may be enthroned before God forever? One who appoints mercy and truth that they preserve him. In other words, Rava Bar Mari explains that the word man, here translated as appoints, right? But it's also like the manna that we received in the wilderness from God, right? Our food came directly from God. So one who acts as a philanthropist and uses his wealth to feed and to care for others and to make sure that they get a good education, it's like he is transmitting the blessings that come to him from God, and they go through him to the needy. So Rabbi Mari explains that the word man is referring to portions of food and interprets the verse as follows. If one provides food to others, he deserves to be enthroned before God, to be shown honor and respect. Right? To be enthroned before God here means that the great Torah scholars will show this person honor. Consequently, it is proper to honor the wealthy who bestow such kindnesses, right? And so, in other words, it is very appropriate, according to this teaching, when you see someone who uses their wealth to help others, right? It doesn't even matter what their reason might be. Like maybe they want to act like the big shot and be recognized in the community and, have be the honoree at a gala or something like that. But when such a person is honored, or when you see or meet such a person, you're fulfilling a biblical credo when you walk up to them and say, I honor you for taking care of others and using your blessings and your wealth to feed others and to educate them. It's beautiful, and you deserve every honor that comes your way. That's a principle we learn from this page, Daf Pei Hey, page 85 in Tractate Eruvin. All right, let's get to comments and questions. Jim Ringenberger, wouldn't that be considered doing work? I think he was referring to using the airspace across the gap. In other words, maybe you're even just wondering about like if you lower the bucket and pull up the water, and apparently not. Like in your house, you don't want to get involved in things that are like truly hard work on Shabbos, because even if it might be permitted, if it causes strain, it's not something we should be doing on Shabbos. But, you certainly are allowed to pick up a stack of books that are on the floor and put them on a table. And there's effort that's involved in that, but it's not the kind of effort that is prohibited on Shabbos. And taking water out of this area, because it's a private domain, that's why those partitions are around the hole, and just lifting some water out so that you can drink it on Shabbos is permitted, and that's not going to be considered work. It's a good question. Lynn, I just love the chutzpah of Rabbi Elazar. He really said that? Like when he heard the teaching in Rav's name, he doubted that the person transmitting the teaching was teaching it correctly, and that's why he wanted to hear it from the horse's mouth. Point out to me where Rav lives, and I will ask him myself. This is real primary source validation, says Lynn. Well done, a real detective, right? So it's not that he's so arrogant. He just literally wants to hear it from the teacher. So maybe I'm ascribing this arrogance to the young teacher, but really he should be honored because he's having trouble believing it, and he'd just like to meet the sage himself. Now, truthfully, maybe what this was all about was he just wanted to meet Rav. Right? He's in town. He knows Rav is in this town. He doesn't know where. And here's an opportunity because they're talking some Torah, and a teaching in the name of this great sage comes up. And he's like, hey, I want to meet him. And his reason is, I want to make sure he really said this. But really what he wants is to meet a sage. And that is very worthy, right? When we get the opportunity to see a great person in person, that's actually something we should try to do. And it's in fact a mitzvah, a commandment, to see the face of a king. That's actually a commandment. One should make every effort that they can to see the face of a king. And that's in a time when the leaders of nations were only kings. Today, that would extend to see the president or the prime minister or whoever is the head of state, to get an opportunity to actually see that person's face, not just on TV, not just hear about it, not just read about it, not just see a photograph, but to literally see the face of a head of state is something we're commanded to do. Why? Because one day we will see the King of Kings. We can't see God face to face ever, but we will see Mashiach, right? So the Messiah will come. And having seen the faces of kings, when we see the face of the King of Kings, the Messiah, we'll see the difference, right? And so if possible, we should actually see the faces of heads of state. And then, if God ever chooses to reveal some aspect of God's self, God, God doesn't have a face like humans have, but God will reveal some aspect of God's presence when the Messiah comes, and the world will be transformed, and the knowledge of God, the awareness of God will be immediate. Like everyone will be able to see the presence of God. Whatever it is that God is doing to allow us to see that, he's going to do something. God will do something so that we can see God's presence throughout the world. That's what the Messianic age is going to be all about. That knowledge of Hashem, knowledge of God, will fill the world as the water fills the sea. Yosef says, did the sages have disciplinarian rules if a student got arrogant and out of hand with an elder scholar? Yes, and what we've seen is if somebody is just asking questions to be snotty, they'll just ignore him. That's what they'll do. And I think Lynn makes a great point that if he was being just kind of arrogant, then Rav wouldn't have answered him at all. But Rav did answer him, so it's probably that he really just wanted to engage with the great man personally. But we do have other incidents where somebody will ask a sage a question, the sage will just ignore him, right? Because maybe that question was an inappropriate question. Now, if people become heretical, well, then they had, they could make him, they could excommunicate, right? They could determine that the sage is, you're not permitted to have contact with him. And that would eventually happen to the great Rabbi Elazar in his dispute with the sages, which is a story we'll encounter when we get about halfway through our journey. An incredible story. It's been referred to a couple of times, and eventually we'll get to that, because Rabbi Elazar was no heretic. And in fact, Rabbi Elazar was right, but it was him being right versus the majority of the sages who on a particular issue were wrong. But we had the general principle that the law in any generation will go according to the majority so that they can make rulings. And they can't, and people can't just keep saying, well, I'm right, I know I'm right. But if it's them against the whole majority, at a certain point, the majority has to be able to make a ruling so that the population, the people, know who to follow. That's going to come later. Let's move on. Lynn says, isn't arrogance almost always based on incomplete information? Yeah. There is always another side, and we don't know all sides, and that's why we say there's 70 faces of the Torah. Very good, Lynn. Sharon says, how common was it to have ruins in the midst of a courtyard between homes for there to be so many rulings on this? I think it's just one of those questions that's very useful when we're trying to parse the law and get to an understanding of what's really going on there. In the same way that, in the Talmud, there are more than two genders. There are 4 genders in the Talmud. There's male, there's female, there's hermaphrodite, which is called androgynous, which has both male and female organs. And there's the tumtum, which has neither male nor female organs. Now, how often is a human born with both male and female, sexual organs, or with neither? That's, an incredibly rare occurrence, 1 in a million, more than 1 in a million. But there's a lot of discussion of cases like that because it raises interesting questions when you're trying to figure out, how we're going to rule in a particular tough legal issue. Having those alternate cases, not because they come up in the real world, but because they do create challenging and interesting discussion, Talmudic discussion. The sages will often bring up these cases, certainly more often than they happen in the real world. And finally, Pam Simmons just needs some clarification. So a proper residence must be a structure with walls and a roof and a door. I think that's what it really boils down to. Something that is a residence, to be considered a residence, and one who is living there needs to contribute to the eruv, or he will restrict the other ones from carrying there. It needs to have walls and a roof and a door. That's what it seems to be. And that's why the barn, the cow shed, the hay shed are all going to count as those kinds of structures. right? What was that list? A hay shed, a cow shed, a wood shed, or a storehouse, right? Like a detached garage. That would work. Even if it doesn't have to have a bathroom, it doesn't have to have a kitchen, it doesn't have to have windows, but it seems that it needs to have walls, a door, and a roof. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. Look forward. Tomorrow's going to be an exciting day, but we are going to be learning as scheduled, right? 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. The country may be going crazy about all the politics. As you know, this is a politics-free zone. So if you want to take a break from all the political craziness that's going to be going on tomorrow, November 3rd, Election Day in the United States, come to AT Daily at our regular time. Looking forward to see you then. All the best.